Okay, thanks and welcome. Thanks for the introduction. I'm Martin, this is Christine, and we will be jointly presenting our work on measuring the GDPR's impact on web privacy. And we did this together with Christopher, Henry, Florian, and Thorsten. And this is about the GDPR. Most of you have at least heard about the GDPR earlier last year when you received a lot of emails telling companies, where companies told you that they really care about your privacy, and they just need you to click one more time on one of these buttons to actually tell them that you agree with them using your data. Well, this was kind of annoying for a lot of people. Actually, the GDPR is a good thing. For those that haven't heard about it, the GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulation, and it's a new data protection law in the European Union. I won't go through all the 100 articles in there, but the most important thing also for our work are that it has new transparency obligations for companies that use personal data, and in short also makes every website that, for example, collects IP addresses on the server side in logging to have a privacy policy to at least tell that. And it also has tougher requirements for consent, which is relevant for the cookies and tracking that you have on a lot of websites. The important thing about the GDPR that it's not just a European, it is just a European law, but it applies to everyone that collects data from European citizens, which also includes like companies in the US and services that offer their services in Europe and therefore allow European users to use them. And what makes the GDPR more effective than previous privacy law is that it allows data protection authorities to pose heavy fines on companies. For example, Google was fined for about $50 million a few weeks ago for not having a privacy policy that is actually clearly telling people what they are doing with their data. And the GDPR already inspired other privacy laws, for example, the new Californian privacy law that will come in effect in 2020 has some similar rules as the GDPR. So our research idea was to study, okay, what effect does the GDPR actually have on the web, right? So we wanted to see how websites reacted, especially in their privacy policies, whether that increased transparency and data privacy protection, and how the new consent mechanisms are implemented for tracking and cookies. So we started collecting data in December 2017, and did this manually and in automatic ways. I'll walk you through the process in a few steps. Our analysis is based on the top 500 ranking of Alexa for each European member state. We heard a talk yesterday that Alexa is probably not the best source for those top lists, but it's still the only top list based on countries. So since the top lists all overlap a bit, like Google, Facebook, YouTube are on every list, in total we had about 6,000 sites to start with. And we also, since we updated the list monthly, we added websites that came into the top list in every month. So we visited all these websites once a month, stored them, and tried to identify the privacy policy, if they have a privacy policy or not. We try to do that automatically, but it's kind of complicated because a lot of websites do not have like a link that says privacy policy here, but it's, for example, hidden in the terms of service or in any other disclaimer. So we also manually analyzed a lot of websites. In total, we collected over 100,000 privacy policies in 23 different languages, and we also used the web archive to collect previous versions of privacy policies that were not within that year. As I said, we also did a lot of manual work annotating the website. So for about 50% of the websites, we were not able to automatically download the privacy policy. So we had a team and manually checked over 3,000 websites at least 3 times before and after the GDPR. And we also manually checked all the websites in our corpus for the cookie consent notices that Christina will talk about in a second. Okay, quick results. Let me zoom in here. This is the amount of websites that have privacy policies before and after the GDPR. So the yellow bar is prior to the GDPR, and the green bar is what was added. So in average, 5% of the websites didn't have a privacy policy prior to the GDPR, but had one afterwards. So this is kind of an effect that you can directly see from the GDPR. And especially in the Baltic states, there were the highest rise. They also had the lowest bars to start with, and over 10% of websites actually added privacy policies around the GDPR enforcement date. We also checked that on the top-level domain, so this is top list-based. And for now, for example, after the GDPR, several countries like .de, Germany, and Spain, and the Netherlands, now all the websites with these top-level domains in our list, 100% of the websites now have privacy policies. And we could also see that there's a global effect. For example, on .com domains, there was an increase, but also on domains based in Russia, for example, that were in the top list. For example, in countries with Russian-speaking minorities, there are a lot of Russian websites used, and also 3% of those websites added privacy policies. We also checked that on the category-based, so on Alexa, all websites are put in a category, whether it's health-related, for example, and finance websites, those have already pretty high level of privacy policies, over 90% after the GDPR. And on the other end, we found adult content pages, and interestingly, government pages, where about 70% of the websites have privacy policies. Then we also tried to, I have to zoom out again. Track the changes, so when did websites actually act? So there was a 2-year grace period. The GDPR was voted on in 2016, and from that on there was a grace period of 2 years. And what you can see here on the left-hand side is how many of the websites of the privacy policies were changed in a specific year, and the line is about the month. And you can see that the majority of websites made a change to their privacy policy in 2018, and on the right-hand side, you can see actually that about 50% of the websites made a change to their privacy policy in May 2018. So they all acted pretty late, right? There's a ton of different analysis in the paper too, so we found that the average length of privacy policies increased by about 1/3, which is not a good thing since the original idea of the GDPR is to make it easier and more clear. We also found that some specific words related to the GDPR come up more often. We did not find a significant effect on trackers and the use of cookies in general, though we saw a lot of websites that made some notable changes, like dropping a lot of third parties, but on average, that was not that significant. We also found an increase in HTTPS, which is we thought would be something like privacy by default, but that is not a trend. That was a general trend, so there's a general trend to using more HTTPS, but that was not too statistically significant around the GDPR. And with that, I will hand over to Christine.
So something else you may have noticed, besides that influx of GDPR-related emails, are those cookie banners or consent notices that now show up on lots of websites and ask you for your consent about the use of cookies or a collection of your personal data. We also tracked how these consent notices changed pre- and post-GDPR. So in January 2018, on average, 46% of websites in the European top lists displayed such a notice. And at the end of May, after GDPR went into effect, we measured 62%. So here you can see in some countries such as Ireland, there was an increase of about 43%. So these increases were much larger than with privacy policies. Those consent notices appear in different shapes, forms, and with different functionalities. And during our different manual annotations, we saw that they're becoming more and more sophisticated. So we decided to have a closer look at those. So these are the simplest types of consent notices. The one on top, that just doesn't really provide you with much of a choice. It just tells you that the website uses cookies, and by continuing to use the site, you agree to that use. And all you can do is just dismiss the banner by clicking on that X. The one below is roughly the same. It just adds an accept or OK button, and it has roughly the same text, so that you really also don't have much of a choice but leave the website. And some even block the underlying website, so you just have to click accept. So, and considering that the European data protection authorities need consent to be freely given by an active affirmative action, these really can't be considered to constitute valid consent under GDPR. So this type of notice, which is some binary notice, you can either accept or refuse all cookies. This kind of notice is what we consider the minimum requirement under GDPR because it gives you some basic option you can choose between. Here we noticed that often cookies are set before some choice is made, so this is also not GDPR compliant. Here are some more complex mechanisms we found. This, we refer to this kind of notice as a slider because here the cookies are grouped into different categories such as social media or website analytics. And the website visitor can then move this slider up and down to select the level of cookie use they're comfortable with. And the problem here is that those categories and their order are determined by the website owner or the whoever has created that consent library. So it's impossible to get certain combinations of choices. For example, here it's not possible to allow social media cookies, but not allow website analytics cookies at the same time. You may have seen this kind of notice before, because these come from the IAB, the Interactive Advertising Bureau we also just heard about in the first talk. They have come up with some consent and transparency framework. And the IAB is an association of online advertisers, and the goal of their framework is to collect consent for those third parties involved in the advertising network and then pass it down the advertising supply chain. The problem with these is that those long lists of vendors usually has like 300 different third parties. And no, first of all, nobody's ever going to make an informed choice for each one of those third parties. And then it also only lists the third parties actually participating in IAB, and it doesn't list many other third parties that might be in use on the website, especially not the big players like Google or Facebook. So it's really both overwhelming and not accurate at the same time. And then there's this type of banner, which also has some categories as in the slider-based thing. But here you can select and deselect all of the categories individually. And we consider this the best among the solutions we found so far because it complies with the GDPR's notion of purpose-based consent. And one thing to look out for here is that often those categories aren't listed out in the open, but they're hidden behind some settings or manage link, and the website visitor only gets to see the OK button, so this can be considered a bit deceiving. So we looked at the distribution of all of these different types of consent notice over the different countries, and we found statistically relevant differences, but I'm not going to go into further detail here. You can look it up in the paper. One thing to point out here is that if you look at the green, red, and gray bars, those are the banners that are not considered, that do not really collect valid consent under GDPR. So our takeaway here is that the majority of website doesn't really gather proper consent from their users. Something else we noticed during our cookie ban analysis is that different kinds of pre-existing implementations were used across lots of websites, like plugins or libraries. And we identified all of the libraries found in our data set, and we found some 30 different libraries. And we analyzed those for important properties necessary to collect valid consent. And the result is this big table, and I'd like to refer you to the paper too for that. It's just too big to briefly get an overview. So what are our takeaways? We saw lots of changes on websites in the month while GDPR went into force. We saw lots of changes with respect to privacy policies and cookie consent notices. And so we assume that this is likely due to GDPR. So the results were different by country, depending on the level of transparency they had before. And some 16% of websites still do not have a privacy policy, and 15% haven't updated theirs since 2016 when the GDPR was adopted. Those consent notices, there's really a lot of confusion regarding those, and the whole situation really needs some clear guidelines from European data protection authorities what's considered to be GDPR compliant. We will make available some of our metadata from our analysis in our GitHub repository, and now we look forward to your comments and questions. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Barry Lieba. About the cookie stuff, maybe it's because I don't live in the EU that all of the cookie consent things I've seen were of the useless category. I've never seen any where you could actually choose something. So, and if I got one of those, I mean, I would know what to do with it maybe if the slider was kind of daunting. I can't imagine my mother would just look at this and say, what's this cookie shice? But, you know, so do you have a sense that even when users are presented with something that has some granularity to select things, they have any equipment to decide what to do with that and actually make an informed decision even when they're given the opportunity to? And the other is, did you do any analysis of websites that are commonly used by people outside the EU versus ones that are only used by people inside the EU?
Okay, so we mainly looked at those top lists and for the EU member states, and there's lots of overlap with websites that are also popular in the US. For example, did you give the number?
No, I think it's 53% of the top 500 most used websites in the US were also part of our corpus. So
right, but did you correlate that with the usefulness or the granularity of the selection you can make?
No, we didn't do that.
Okay.
But sometimes those banners are only displayed if you access the site from within the EU, so you might just miss out on some of those notices.
I'm missing out, yes. Thank you.
The thing is with these, the question whether actually people know what to do with them, right? So this is still an open question, and we are looking into that right now. The thing is that that people often actually fear that it breaks the website, right? So, and that happens, right? There are a lot of websites that actually blocked users from the European Union directly after the GDPR, and also some of these cookie consent notices, actually, especially the ones where you have to click accept, right? They redirect you to whatever other website. That's not okay, but that leads to, if there's only a few websites that actually don't work, if you do not accept, then it makes users actually click accept everywhere because they fear their website wouldn't work anymore. And that's something that has to change, actually.
Yeah, that was the sense I had just from not studying it.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Hi, just one question. Like you said that the privacy policies have increased the number of words that they have, etc., etc. As far as I know, GDPR requires to have like explanations like that are easy to understand, intelligible for people. Yeah. Did you notice that they became more legal-wise or maybe more simple to understand? Because like this increase in word might be just legal terms, so I was wondering.
So we looked at the legal terms if they show up and actually the number of legal terms showing up in these policies increased. So it's likely that they are not easier, and that's an issue because the privacy policies are mostly designed by lawyers, right, to be compliant with the law and not to actually explain in easy words to users what the websites are doing. And that's also still, and that's due to the problems with the e-privacy regulation that is directive, which is also on its way legally in the European Union. That's trying to clarify how especially web services should deal with that, but that's kind of not out there yet. And so long, for now, all the websites are just making it more complicated.
I see.
Yeah, we also had the impression that lots of websites, especially smaller ones, just copy their policy from somewhere else. Yeah. And we're currently also thinking of doing some more analysis in this about the actual content. And
Thanks.
Hello, thanks for the interesting presentation. I have a question that why do you consider this multi-option as a good thing? Because the GDPR states that by default only the minimum amount of data should be collected for tracking purposes and so on, and everything else should be opt-in.
Yeah.
And in my experience, like there are a lot of European websites where everything is enabled by default, and this of course is a clear violation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is the one where some things are pre-selected, right? There that decides the website owners can decide whether they want to allow some do opt-in and some do opt-out. Like here, the marketing thing is an opt-in and the others are opt-out. And actually, you are right. So nothing should be pre-selected except the necessary cookies, because that's something where they can argue there's a different legal basis for that. But that's something that even if they have this option-based, purpose-based banners, they still are not completely compliant because they pre-select things and don't ask for opt-in.
Yeah, we just chose to display this version because it shows that these can be selected and deselected.
Mm-hmm. And I have another question: that have you thought about looking at mobile apps? Because I believe there the problem is even worse. That clearly, for example, a camera app doesn't need to have access to your address book, but many apps refuse to work if they don't get one.
Yeah, no, we haven't looked into that, but that's definitely an interesting question.
Thank you.
I have a super quick question. Does this work? Like, does me clicking no actually result in cookies getting or less?
Yeah, that depends on the concrete implementation of those notices.
Have a look at that.
Yeah, so one of the properties here is if it actually can block cookies. And some of these libraries, they just display the notice and don't support anything else. So you can't just...
There's also always the problem that, like, if you click on, for example, you deselect an advertiser that you don't want your data to be shared with, that they send an opt-out request to the server, right? But that actually still the third party is still included in all the websites, but somehow you can't be sure if they actually recorded that and if they follow that. So no, we don't know actually.
Fair enough. All right, let's take them.